Angela Down, Director of Collections at the BFI. And I'll ask just a few questions, but then we're going to open up for the whole audience questions. A question, I guess I'm going to start with the curatorial side, Mel and Will. So, I mean, I used to work at the V&A too, and this whole, the fetishization, the veneration of the original, that is obviously just going to completely fall apart with trying to collect and preserve XR material. How are museums and archives going to get to grips with this change of mentality?
Okay. I think it's not necessarily a case of that being inevitable. Certainly, I deal with a collection which is all about the first person, or the first people to use computers to create art, and there is lots of vulnerability around it being the first, and it's important that it was collected. Should have as a little note that there's some really interesting files in the museum where the curators at the time were very dismissive of the objects and made claim that actually the museum shouldn't acquire them. They didn't think they had aesthetic validity, but we're really glad that they did acquire them. So it was because that they were the first, that they were acquired and that they were the originals. So although many artists do want their work across many platforms, and it shouldn't just be about a singular object, I think there still needs to be a case where that is, if that's the intention of the artist. For example, we have some software pieces where it really is the intention of the artist that there should only be one, it should be shown in one place at one time. Although the artwork lends itself, it could be shown in multiple places on different platforms, but that's not the intention of the artist. So what we do is very much a conversation with those artists and think about what were the intentions behind the work. So that doesn't entirely answer your question, but I don't think it's a given that it needs to be put out there in all different shapes and forms, and that the original no longer has a place. But it certainly is changing. It's not just the case that there's always only one of something, and then that has to be revered.
Yeah, I wondered, moving away from artists into the filmmaker side, although filmmakers are also artists, of course, that I wonder how precious in the digital era filmmakers are about the idea of the original. I think from a preservation perspective, they'll sleep better at night knowing their master materials and assets are safe. But in terms of the accessible, enjoyable experience that they've created, I don't think there's much preciousness around the original artifact per se. I think in this particular territory that we're talking about, there's going to be more anxiety about the way in which the experience as a whole is represented rather than the sort of original file. I would say. I don't know.
All right, I've got another question for sort of Tate and curators, let us say Tom and Jack, about standards. So obviously preservation has been entirely built around standards, but standards also have a sort of constriction concept behind them. Do we think that that's going to... we talk about embedding and working with creators. Does that restrict creativity in any way? Deathly silence.
Well, can we ask that to Dom? How do you feel about the idea of, some kind of interference in your production process, or how would you respond to the idea of having to use, approaching particular guidelines in your work for the technologies you use, for example?
Nice. I think there are always going to be limitations in the tool sets that you work with. And if those limitations are imposed by hardware limitations or software limitations, it's not that much different to limitations that are in place to help with the curation or the preservation of those pieces. So you're always kind of working around things. But I think if I was creating the Archway again, with the preservation of it in mind, I would take a very different approach. And I don't know whether that would significantly impact the outcome. So it's a really, really tricky thing to kind of say in a hypothetical way, but I suppose the intention of those limitations is kind of secondary to the fact that they're there.
I think I don't know if you were going to talk about this, Tom, but the point you were making earlier about how these 3D object standards are only just being set for static objects, and they're being arrived upon by museums that are digitizing their physical objects, and these 3D objects, these 3D standards sort of describe those static objects. And these 3D engines are requesting new things. These 3D objects are doing new things all the time. There's all these new forms like Alembic and stuff, which is this format for being that's being accelerated by use in CGI and stuff, isn't it, in films, you know, and these 3D objects are describing their future as well as their current state. You know, they contain information about like animation information and stuff. So it's really hard to like say for an artist that wants to create in a medium, and by like definition, an artist is going to be sort of pushing the limitations of what's possible with these 3D engines to say, like, don't use this new really exciting ability within this software. Just use the ones that we understand or something. Kind of seems like that would be a real shame or something, you know.
And also just to say that I think the idea of a standards-based approach to preserving virtual reality materials is just like a very distant thing, really, at the moment, you know. And just trying to do kind of manageable, you know, tests and experiments on things like 3D file formats was very difficult to do in a manageable way and an exhaustive way in the research we were doing, just because there are so many potential variables with each of these objects, and then these 3D model objects are just a tiny part of this huge ecosystem. So it just, you know, it spreads out in every direction, and standards are not going to get us very far in the short term, I think, at least. Yeah.
All right, I've got another question, and it's for Stephen. So, present company, London-based, completely exempted from this. Where do you think in the wider world has collection and preservation of immersive media been taking place the most and most successfully? In other words, our peers and cohorts across the globe.
Well, so one of the amazing things in the last probably year is a kind of community of practice around this, and so we're all, at least in the London-centric world, meeting regularly to share case studies and discuss it. And when we met last time was at a great technical workshop that the Tate organised, and I asked the same question: where in the world is the organisation who's most ahead in this world, who have 300 of these acquired and documented and preserved perfectly? And I don't think we know. I don't think there is an understanding of where the best practice or where advanced collecting is happening in this domain. I mean, I'd love to be corrected if there's like a Google Sheets of the top ranked VR collectors, but as far as I can see, no one really knows where it's happening at high volume. And maybe that implies it's not, because we all talk to each other and social media makes that really easy. So my suspicion is everyone is dipping their toes and doing R&D experimentation phases with an aim to form consensus building communities of practice. But I don't think high volume is happening anywhere.
Well, before I turn over to questions, really, that's just going to raise one point that I want to raise that actually I don't think has an answer. But everyone here, we're looking at experts, but these are all experts who are taking place in experimentation. And experimentation is R&D, and R&D requires funding. And what it is something new. This is a new kind of material that's coming into the cultural heritage sector, which already, I'm obviously on a party political here, but already has had, is under funding pressure. So how do we come up with the funding to undertake the R&D that's necessary? We've seen that government supports, which is good, the creative industries, Arts Council, also working with creators. But what to me seems to be the gap now is the preservation and then the re-accessing again of this material in future. So having said that positive commentary, I'm going to hand over to everyone else to start asking questions.
Thanks very much, everyone. That was amazing. My question's actually following on from that last point. It's about where spaces of collaboration can happen. So I work in theatre, and which is still the medium or the art that claims its liveness. Still, believe it or not. But there is a recognition now that if the documents born of theatre and performance are to be sustainable, then artists need to collaborate with archivists, curators from the onset, really. And I've come to the point where we need to be embedding them into the production process. But I'm interested in where those spaces can happen, what needs to change. I'm actually interested in the museum as a social space, a space of diverse interpretation, and how that can be captured. It was just a thought, really, for anyone to comment on.
I feel I should say something, as the V&A also has performance is in its mission statement. It's a large part of what they care and look after, and have a theatre and performance collection. Having said that, I know very little about that actual aspect of the museum. So my advice would be reach out, get in touch with the curators, and I think everything always begins with a conversation. And I think very much like this, it goes from there. It goes from a one-to-one meeting and then throwing ideas around to thinking, to brainstorming and thinking, coming up with different ideas and solutions. So though that's not a specific example, I mean, an answer, that would be the best I could offer.
It feels like there's a job of work to be done, not least by the BFI at some stage, in talking to content makers about digital in general and its precariousness. I don't just mean in the VR immersive field that we've been talking about today, but what the XR community lovingly call flatties or flat films, which is my background, which is sort of endearing and yeah. You know, what I'm working on acquiring this, but I also acquire digital files quite often for feature films and short films for filmmakers who are surprised to hear about the possibility that their hard drives might not work in 5 years, or that they're going to, you know, that something being online doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. So I think there's or accessible, yeah. And so I think there's a whole job of work around designing some messaging for the industry, and I would include games, VFX, and I think there's collectively a real role that institutions could play in developing frameworks that would then feed back into production cycles and internal archiving practice in some of the bigger studios. I'm really intrigued by the studios, the traditional film studios and their arrangements for archives, because they have their own. What Netflix is doing, you asked, Stephen, where's the biggest collection of VR that's properly preserved? You know, we can debate properly, but Google Spotlight must have put a lot of resource into guarding its own IP for in terms of its long tail revenue projections. So I don't know the answers, but there's work to be done, definitely.
Hello. Several of you have mentioned the word documentation alongside preservation, and the community that's very well known for documentation, certainly an indexing for access, is the library and information science community. And I just wondered, Stephen, I think you were the first person to mention documentation and modelling alongside standards. Are there any thoughts from the panel on cooperating or collaborating with the library and information community?
It's worth noting the British Library, I think Kaylin is here today, and maybe colleagues. The British Library are in, I talked about a London-centric group who meet regularly to talk about all these emerging media or new forms or complex digital objects, whatever you call them. So the British Library are certainly in that mix, and I will fess up to it. That data model, the moving image community belt, is just a rip-off of Thurber. Librarians always get there first, in my experience. I think libraries have to play a part in this, because this is hitting libraries too. Interactive narratives are now, you know, Kaylin could tell you, a British Library collecting challenge. So I don't know if that answers it, but for me, libraries are certainly in this and certainly contributing actively. And if we don't involve them, we're going to fail, of course.
I'm going to just add 2 words, because the V&A also includes the National Art Library. So I've been talking across, I refer to the museum, but in everything that I talk about, also the library is key. And if anything, they're the first people that we go to, because libraries have been discussing digital preservation for a lot longer than we have. So it is definitely part of that conversation, if not leading.
Hi,
I was just going to say one other thing from the Tate perspective. Sorry, just about the information stuff. Yeah, I mean, digital preservation has kind of become increasingly tied in with what we do in time-based media conservation, and that's resulted in this kind of trickle through of standards and ideas from the library and information science community. And yeah, myself, Patricia Folko, and other colleagues have been doing lots of work to kind of integrate that stuff with our existing collections management systems and digital repository systems on the horizon. So yeah, I think that kind of communication is definitely happening.
definitely get in touch as well if you have any feedback for us.
Yeah.
I just had a question. Picking up on something that I think, Willie, you'd said in your talk about what type of content you considered to be sort of film heritage, I suppose, which I know is, you know, as you said, sort of a blurry line. But I'm interested in this area. I think we're all trying to figure out where our jurisdiction is, I suppose, around these things that could be considered derivatives of another kind of media, but it may yet turn out to be a whole new form of media in itself, and it has its own sector and its own, you know, way of dealing with it. We don't know that yet. But is there a risk that somewhere in this I suppose model we're in right now, that we're going to miss things, that we're not going to record things, that we don't consider a clear part of our jurisdiction, and at the same time also not supporting artists who are working in that space as well?
Yes. No. I suppose yes, but I would caveat what I said because we're just starting small, I guess. So I think, you know, frankly, between friends and the live stream, I asked Jaisha Patel about her work, and I invited her to the roundtable because I know her other work, and I know her as a filmmaker, and I knew that she would be up for, you know, allowing us to experiment with her. I think, as you say, it's rapidly proliferating. The mapping generic definitions, old generic definitions, onto immersive experiences is sort of redundant. And you know, I think it was at your presentation you showed the work that Limina had done in developing a new generic understanding. So yes, you know. The charter, Royal Charter, BFI's Royal Charter was drawn up in the 80s, and I don't think anyone knew at that point when they put moving image in there exactly what, or maybe they did, maybe they were being extremely prescient, but that has exploded. You know, it didn't just explode digitally. We've got enough trouble keeping on top of the internet years, but we are looking at a whole range of things. I think within VR, you're right, we could look at quite a broad range of genres and just say we're collecting VR, and these are all sort of legitimate forms, whether that's educational, architectural modelling, car design, or a woodland animal. Where I'm a bit iffier, if you like, is around the AR, XR stuff, the mediated worlds stuff, where after a while you're effectively collecting design, or you're collecting sort of production design, because the meanings. The meaningful exchange in that experience between you as participant and the world that is being laid upon your reality is, you know, one person might do it at McDonald's, the other person might do it out in the Hebrides. You know, you're moving so far away from being able to sort of encapsulate one particular experience that you could collect all the Pokemon Go monsters in a sort of production design thing. How do you begin to capture the experience which becomes so individualized, I suppose, would be my...
I think you raised a really interesting point about, you know, the rise of the screen arts, because the collecting organizations have been sort of divided up, sometimes by format, sometimes by theme, like BFI, moving image, IWM, war, and now we have a new format that's cutting across. So you're really asking about how do we devise the distributed national collection for XR, and I don't think anyone's quite got there yet. But just to say that we've just been at the BFI entering into discussion about with games collecting institutions, which is the same sort of thing, and who's doing what where, and who might do a little more. So we're in the really, really early stages of it. But you're absolutely right to ask the question.
So I think we've got somebody who wants to pose a question. I think that will be the last question.
Thank you. I'm just picking up on the point that Stephen made about Victorian films being collected 20 or 30 years later. And given that we are in an art school, I was wondering, I want to ask Judy a question maybe. Can you imagine, what do you think should be the role of a university in terms of preparing students to take on this caring role? Because if we'll wait 20 years to collect their work, it will be on this artist's shoulders actually for a while.
So this is something we talk to our students about a lot, and I recently had an experience where I was talking to a group of BA Fine Arts students, and we had the conversation about, you know, what happens to hard drives, and several people in the room went visibly grey, and I said, it's okay, you will go home and back all of this stuff up and then it will be fine. So, I mean, there are a couple of things to address. One is communication, trying to explain to our students all the time what the problems are and how they can take really simple steps to improve things in terms of their self-archiving. And an archiving app came out recently called Art 360, and I think we all had really great hopes that that was going to be the answer to everybody's prayers. And it's a fairly blunt tool, but it does have some basic information about how you can go about ordering your own material and backing it up in multiple places and making sure that it's safe. In terms of the university's wider role in actually collecting, and the conversation I've had a lot with some of the guys who are squidged up on our sofas is these people are working in national institutions. They have specialised digital teams, and it's often the people like us who are actually the advanced guard in terms of collecting, because our students are doing really interesting things and they're sometimes the first people to be doing it. And the really huge problem with looking at preserving things like virtual reality artwork is that every single case is unique. We're dealing with everything on a case-by-case basis, and all these smaller institutions like us, who've always been in the vanguard of collecting stuff and trying to prevent things falling through the cracks, in these moments of a kind of a, like a commercial land grab when it is the Wild West, is that we are now really struggling to do what we normally do in this situation. And that's why I think, what a brilliant thing for Melanie to have said in one of her responses, everything always starts with a conversation. And I think it's a really, really important moment for us, the little guys who are out there at the coalface, meeting all of this stuff for the first time, to be somehow meshed into these more professional networks to see if we can find ways of working together.
I wonder if there's also a big group conversation or lobby, in fact, to make sure that there's a lot of money and support going into immersive experiences from audience perspective, from tech perspective, from employment. When will the themes and discussions that we've been having today be included in the schema of that value chain? Because if they can be understood, if the preservation and heritage case can be made for activity where there's a lot of investment going in at different stages of that chain, if that can be brought in sync with that, then that may unlock some resource to help tackle some of these problems.